Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all, and especially our speakers, Julie Orringer, closest to me, and Elizabeth Meyer-Bernstein, to the Charleston Literary Festival. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsor for this event, Kay Bachman. And while I'm welcoming you all, there's an extra call out for the 100 or so students from the Marvin Ridge High School outside Charlotte, North Carolina. Yay! So Julie Orringer is the author of 2 award-winning publications, The Invisible Bridge, a novel, and How to Breathe Underwater, a short story collection, both New York Times notable books. She's the winner of the Paris Review's Plimpton Prize and the recipient of several prestigious fellowships, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. Julie's with us today to discuss her most recent book, a novel, The Flight Portfolio, a historical novel based on a little-known but very significant and dramatic initiative by the American Emergency Rescue Committee to spirit away prominent European refugees such as Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, and Hannah Arendt from Vichy France, which was under Nazi occupation at the time. It's a gripping and heart-rending story, and I wasn't at all surprised to learn that the book is the basis for a forthcoming miniseries, which will focus on the true adventures of the Emergency Rescue Committee and its chief activist in France, Varian Fry. Together with Julie, Julie will be in conversation with Elizabeth Meyer-Bernstein, graduate of Smith College, who trained as a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania and is now the Distinguished Dean of the College of Charleston's Honors College. And I hope some of her students are here today as well. So we're going to start today with Julie, who will read a little bit from the podium, and then she'll have a conversation with Elizabeth Meyer-Bernstein, and then Elizabeth will invite some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks to the Literary Festival for welcoming me here. It's great to be back in Charleston. It's great to be anywhere after these couple of years we've had. But I'm especially pleased to be a part of this event, which just seems to be such a timely and welcome celebration of the many types of literary endeavor that we have going on right now in our country. So here is a bit of something that doesn't go on in our country. This chapter that I'm going to read to you from the beginning of the novel takes place in the south of France in 1940. And the title of the chapter is Gordes, G-O-R-D-E-S, which is a place name. And everything else should be pretty clear. There was, as it turned out, no train to the village where the Chagalls lived. One of many complications he'd failed to anticipate. He had to pay a boy with a motorbike to run him up from the station at Cavaillon, 10 miles at a brain-shaking pace along a narrow, rutted road. On either side rose ochre hills, striated with grapevines and lavender and olive trees. Overhead, a blinding white-veined sky. The smell was of the boy's leather jacket and of charred potatoes, exhalate of his clever homemade fuel. At the foot of the village, the boy parked in a shadow, accepted Varian's francs, and tore off into the distance before Varian could arrange a ride back. The streets of Gordes, carved into a sun-struck limestone hill above the Luberon Valley, offered little in the way of shade. He would have given anything to be back in Marseille with a glass of Aperol before him, watching sailors and girls, gangsters and spice vendors, parading the Canebière. The Chagalls had only agreed to see him on the basis that he not bring up the prospect of their emigration. But what other subject was there? The Nazis had taken Paris months ago. They were burning books in the streets of Alsace. They could send any refugee over the border at will. At least the Chagalls had agreed that was something. But as he reached the house, an ancient Catholic girls' school on the Rue de la Fontaine Basse, he found himself fighting the urge to flee. His credentials, if anyone examined them, amounted to a fanatic's knowledge of European history, a desire to get out from behind his desk in New York, and a deep frustration with his isolationist nation. And yet this was his job. He'd volunteered for it. What was more, he believed he could do it. He raised his hand and knocked. An eye appeared in the brass circlet of the peephole, and a girl in a striped apron opened the door. She listened, strangling her index finger with one dark curl as he stated his name and mission. Then she ushered him down a corridor and out into a courtyard where a stone path led to a triangle of shade. There, at a bare wooden table, Chagall and his wife sat at lunch. The painter in his smock, his hair swept back from his forehead in silver waves, Bella in a close-fitting black dress too hot for the day. "Ah, Monsieur Fry," Chagall said, rising to meet him. The painter's eyes were large and uncommonly sharp, his expression one of bemusement. "You've come after all. I thought you might. You won't forget our agreement, will you?" "All I want is your company for an hour." "You're lying, of course, but you lie charmingly." They sat together at the table, Bella on Varian's left, the painter to his right. He, Varian Fry, sitting down with the Chagalls, with Chagall, author of those color-saturated visions, those buoyant bridal couples and intelligent-eyed goats he'd seen in hushed rooms at the Museum of Modern Art. Bella filled a plate with brown, hard-crusted miche, soft cheese, sardines crackling with salt. By the way, one of my readers of this book said, "It's a war, there was like no food. Why do you have to describe food on like every page?" I'm into food. I like food. She handed it across the table, assessing Varian in silence. "Had you been here a few days ago, this is all about food, I'm sorry. We would have had tomatoes," Chagall said. "A farmer brings them up to the market on Thursdays. I'm sorry we don't have more to offer. The bread's a little hard on the tooth, but I'm afraid, but c'est la guerre." "This is lavish," Varian said. "You're too kind." "Not at all. We like to share what we have." He gestured around him at the bare yellow stones, the rough benches, the shock of gold-green hillside visible through an archway in the wall. "As you see, we're living a quiet and retired life in our little dacha. No one will bother us here at Gord." "You have a studio," Varian said. "You're still producing work. That's what makes you dangerous." "Our daughter says the same," Bella said. "She's been saying it for months. But you understand, Monsieur Fry, my husband's reputation will protect him. Vichy wouldn't dare touch us." "With respect, Madame Chagall, I don't believe that for a moment. Vichy is subject to the Nazis' whims, and we all know what they're capable of. I've seen it myself. I was in Berlin in '35, sent by the magazine I worked for. My last night in town, there was a riot on the Kurfürstendamm. The things I saw, men pulled from their shops and beaten in the streets, an old man stabbed through the hand at a cafe table, boys dragging a woman by her hair. These things happened in Germany," Chagall said, his tone harder now. "They won't happen here, not to us." "Let me speak to my friend at the consulate," Varian said. "Ask him to start a file for you at least. If you do decide to leave, it might take months." Chagall shook his head. "My apologies, Monsieur Fry. I'm sorry you had to come all this way in vain, but perhaps you'd like to have a look at the studio before you go. If you've finished, that is." Varian couldn't speak. He could scarcely believe that a person of Chagall's intelligence, a person of his experience, could fail to see what he himself saw clearly. Chagall rose and crossed the courtyard to a set of 10-foot-high blue doors, and Varian got to his feet. He nodded his thanks to Bella, then followed Chagall across the broken paving stones. Beyond the blue doors was a long, high-ceilinged room with a wall of windows, the former refectory of the girls' school. Canvases lay about everywhere, and for long minutes, Varian walked among them in silence. As well as he knew the painter's work, he had never seen it like this, in its pupal state, damp and mutable, smelling of turpentine, raw wood, wet clay. From the canvases rose ghost-like images, a grave-eyed Madonna hovering above a shadowed town, serenaded by cows and angels, crucified Christ wrapped in a prayer shawl, his head encircled by grieving sages, a woman kneeling beside a river, pressing a baby to her chest, clusters of red and white flowers rising like flames. It's no small matter to cross an ocean, Chagall said. More can be lost than canvas and paint. An artist must bear witness, Monsieur Fry. He cannot turn away, even if he wishes to. An artist can't bear witness if he's dead, Varian said. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Julie, for starting off this conversation. By reading the beginning of your book, it's extremely captivating, and I think it did a wonderful job setting the stage for this conversation. I also want to thank you for coming back to Charleston. It's good to have you here, and thank you to everyone who's decided to join us today. So during this time in history, 1940, 1941, when the book takes place, I mean, there's some, obviously well-known horrific villains that are around at that time, but there are also some incredible heroes. What led you to choose to write about the hero Varian Fry, and why was his story particularly appealing to you?
So, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, Varian Fry was somebody whose name I had not encountered in all of my education, not in my Jewish education, not in my own study of history. I didn't learn about him until I was almost finished, actually, with a draft of my previous novel, The Invisible Bridge. And as I started to read about the Franco-German armistice, I started just to look at the articles of the armistice and try to just learn more about that arrangement. And so I Googled one of the clauses, which was called the Surrender on Demand Clause, and up came this memoir by this guy, Varian Fry, called Surrender on Demand. Had never heard of it, had never heard of him, and it turns out that he was this American journalist and editor and publisher. He was the head of a small political imprint who had done a lot of political writing himself. He had been in Europe in '35, as I was reading about in this section. He had been the editor of this magazine called The Living Age, which was really about like introducing European current events to Americans. And while he was in Europe at that time, he kind of had this unusual window into the kind of architecture of the Nazi leadership, and people were really speaking openly about their plans for the Third Reich. And so he wrote about that for the New York Times in the mid-30s, and nobody was really paying that much attention to the alarms that he was raising. But as then conditions worsened and the world went to war, he realized that something had to be done to save the imperiled artists and writers of France and of the other occupied countries who had fled to France. And so he formed this organization with a couple of others in New York who were similarly concerned. And as the representative of this group, the Emergency Rescue Committee, he went to France. He had this list of 200 names, and he had about $3,000 that he wore like taped to his body because he wasn't supposed to be carrying money into France. And he thought he was going to be there for about a month and somehow find these 200 refugee artists and get them out of France. So much easier said than done, as it turned out. It was very difficult to coordinate everybody's papers. It was difficult to actually find transports out. But despite all of that, he eventually managed to save more than 2,000 writers and artists with the help of a number of others who were working with him and who had previously been doing similar work. And so when I heard about this story, I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. It's this marvelous hero's tale. He changed the course of the arts as we know it in the 20th century by making sure that these people got out and continued to make work. But the real impetus for novel making here was not even that hero's tale. It was more like his personal tale. Who was he? Why would he undertake something like this when it imperiled him personally and he had never done anything like it? What was it about his own history that dovetailed in a way with this larger history? And so that was what really made me feel like the story wanted to be its own novel and not just a footnote to the other novel, which would have rather been unfortunate.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about his personal story in a little bit.
Yeah.
So as a writer of this particular genre, you're really tasked with interweaving history and fiction into a captivating novel. In fact, the story of Varian Fry is true. Many of the characters that are in the book are actually fiction, right? And so how were you able to navigate your responsibilities to the historical truth? And was it particularly challenging because Varian is actually, a well-known individual?
Yeah, well, I like how your formulation that I was tasked with this job places the responsibility elsewhere than myself. Like, I have to be honest. Like, I asked for this. I took it on, and had I known how difficult that particular element of it was going to be, I don't know if I would have gone there. I mean, the previous book also merged fact and fiction, but the fact, I mean, apart from the large historical facts of the war and of the situation I was writing about in France and Hungary at the time, the personal stories were invented, or they were private. They belonged to my family. They weren't kind of part of the public record of history. And so dealing with Varian's story, even though his name is not nearly as well known as it should be, he is somebody whose life has been documented extensively, not only in his own memoirs, but by various biographers. He's been featured in museum exhibitions. There's been a documentary in progress for many, many years about his life. And so I kind of was starting with this many lifetimes work of study into this person. And I was so daunted at first by the sheer task of trying to understand who he was and of how the work that he did actually unfolded in France that I felt completely overwhelmed and unable to do anything. So I actually researched this book for about 6 or 7 years before I could even put a word to the page, because there was just so very much to learn. I mean, the intricacies of how people got visas in the south of France in 1940, I mean, I won't even begin to tell you about it, except to say that one of the things that was most challenging was that the United States was not very welcoming at that time, particularly to degenerate artists trying to flee Europe. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in our own country, and particularly in our State Department. And so there were many barriers that were imposed by our own country. And then there was, of course, the difficulty of obtaining French exit visas, and the timing of all these things had to line up. And meanwhile, the Nazis were looking for a lot of these people who were trying to escape. So I really wanted to represent all of that accurately. I really wanted there to be a fictional record of a factual endeavor, because the endeavor itself felt so important and so, so full of chutzpah that this one guy would have said, I'm going to go there and make this happen, even though I've never done anything like this. But then the thing about it that I think was both most complicated and, in a way, just as important was his personal story. He grew up in a rather kind of conservative, waspy way. He went to boarding schools, and then he went to Harvard. But he was always a bit of a renegade. He dropped out of school because he didn't like the way things were run at his school. There was a lot of hazing at the school that he went to, Hotchkiss, and he protested it. He was like, there's no way that this should be the way things work. And so he left that school. And then even when he was at Harvard, he always was kind of at odds with the administration. At one point, he was almost expelled for putting a for sale sign on the dean's lawn. And meanwhile, when he was in school, it was the 20s, and he was gay, and this was very difficult because it was like, though Harvard actually at the time had a pretty vibrant gay culture, it was all underground. And there was a sense that anything that happened had to be happening sort of like, in a way that would be beneath the administration's notice. And so, yet, he and his pal and sometime boyfriend, Lincoln Kirstein, had this incredible outre avant-garde magazine where they were printing all this like unbelievably groundbreaking work by people like Juna Barnes and Ezra Pound that would not have been printed at the time by the Harvard Advocate, which was like the accepted literary magazine. And all this stuff was so cool. I just was so fascinated to discover this history that I just thought, oh man, this has to be a kind of major theme in the novel as well. But because the life of gay America at that time was so hidden, there was not as much record kept of what he would have been doing and who he would have been doing it with at that time. And so, though there are really interesting accounts that exist about who he was involved with romantically in France while he was there, and there are interesting things in the archives at Columbia where all of his papers are kept, so much of what would have been going on in his personal life would have been held in secrecy and not recorded. And so that was where I sort of felt like there was an aperture for me as a creative artist to imagine what it might have been like for him and what he would have been feeling and who he might have been involved with and how those entanglements might have dovetailed with the difficult political situation he faced at the time. And so that was where some of the art making of the novel really had room to kind of unfold.
Yeah, I mean, you portray him as homosexual in the book, but clearly struggling with his sexual identity. I mean, he has an open marriage with his wife in New York, and he's rekindled a relationship with his college lover, his fictitious college lover. And so why did you feel it was so important to have his sexuality as a major theme throughout the book?
Yeah, because it was a major theme for him in his life, which was something that became clearer and clearer to me as I did my research. When he was in France and away from his wife for the first time since their marriage, I think he had the opportunity for a kind of personal reckoning that was maybe one of his kind of major emotional entries into adulthood, I think. And being in France, there was a little bit more freedom around sexuality in a way that I think was liberating and was also different from the kind of downtown, like Lincoln Kirstein's downtown gay scene at the time. And so I think that though I don't want to be reductive about the connections between his sexuality and his work, I do think that as somebody who felt like he had to hide his sexuality throughout most of his, first 3 decades, he might have understood something about what it meant to be hiding out, to feel persecuted, to need to be saved in some way. And so I thought that he might have had a particular emotional affinity for the artists who he was working with, maybe for some of those reasons. But also, I think that as somebody who felt a little bit on the outside as he was growing up, he also spoke about having felt emotionally rescued on many occasions by the work of the artists who he was saving. And so he had this intense emotional connection with, people like André Breton or Max Ernst or Chagall. And he felt like the power of art to create connection and to make people feel heard who otherwise might not have been was worth the risk of his own life.
Yeah. So we talked about Fry and his heroism. In fact, he's been recognized by the United States and France and Israel for all his heroic efforts during World War II. And his work, as you mentioned, saved thousands of Jewish lives. But throughout the book, he always felt like, and he talks about himself as a failure. Yeah. Right? So he's doing all this amazing work, and he, even at the very end of the book, he feels like he's failed. So why do you feel it was so important to show that he was harboring such self-doubt and insecurity throughout the entire book, even when he came back to New York?
Yeah, well, first of all, because it was true.
Yeah.
I mean, what was he doing? What was he thinking, going there and trying to do this work with no experience, without any of the kinds of connections that would really be helpful to him? I mean, it's one of those situations where we have to hold 2 truths in mind at once. it was stupid to do what he did. It was necessary and important and heroic to do what he did. And so I guess what we have to understand is that really, in order for him to achieve what he did, he had to recognize his limitations. He had to know where he needed help. So when he got to France, he had to be able to articulate to himself and to the others in the Emergency Rescue Committee that he needed more money, he needed more connections, he needed to know how to do this work. And by virtue of admitting his own limitations, he was able to start assembling around him people like Daniel Benedict or people like Otto Albert Hirschman, who had experience with how to get visas, how to manage an underworld operation, how to find, avenues for getting money into the operation, some of which were not all above board. Like, he really needed, even down to the very basic kinds of help, like where were these refugees? His associates, Mary Jane Gold and Miriam Davenport, helped to connect him with the artists themselves, who were, many of them, in hiding. And so actually, I think one of the things that was smartest about his approach to this work was his admission of limitation, And then later in the course of the work, part of what this was about for him was recognizing that the initial vision of the mission was fundamentally flawed. So the Emergency Rescue Committee, how did they make this list of 200 artists and writers? They kind of consulted people who had already fled and come to the United States, prominent artists, and then people like Alfred Barr, who is running the Museum of Modern Art. And they came up with this list of the best and the brightest. But that list itself was flawed because people like, for example, Hannah Arendt were not on that list. I mean, Hannah Arendt was barely, she was completely unknown. She had barely finished her graduate studies. He only found out about her because Walter Benjamin had read her graduate thesis and said, this person's work is incredible. But he wasn't looking for an unknown recent graduate student at the time. He was looking for people like Ernst. And so the more time he spent in France, the more time he spent interviewing refugees who heard about his operation and came to his office asking for help, the more he understood how dire things were, the more he realized that the idea of making a list of 200 people and just, shunting all of the resources toward those few lives was morally reprehensible. It there was no basis for being able to argue in favor of it. And so I think part of the reason for his sense of failure was that he just wanted to help more and more individuals. And so when he came back to the States, he made it his business to try to tell as many people as possible about what was actually going on the ground in France, and to muster as much support for life-saving operations as possible.
Yeah, so the big moral issue, right, in this book is, how do you choose who's worthy of saving and who's not? And so a challenge to this moral dilemma that you really created for him was the story of Tobias Castelson, right? So and I'm going to read a quote from the book here. So Tobias's father, and I'll hope you tell us a little bit about Tobias's story in a second, confronts very near the end of the book, and he says this: "I know the value of art. I like to read and look at paintings as much as the next guy, more than most guys, if you can believe it. But this is a goddamn war, and they're all human beings, and how can you presume to pick which ones to save and which ones to throw into the fire?" Can you tell us about Tobias and how Varian then navigates choosing to save Tobias, and how he, especially because Tobias ends up being not who he's told he is? Oh, sorry. Was I not supposed to say that?
No, we're all friends here.
We're all friends here, yes.
Well, I actually had a lot of fun with that whole intrigue, even though in truth, it's not really about, to say that I had fun with it, I had fun as a writer with it, but it was a very complicated and morally ambiguous situation, right? So Tobias Katznelson is the son of the man who Varian's former lover has been seeing. And the way the father explains that his son is a physics prodigy, and he is deeply imperiled because the work that he was doing is of great interest to the Nazis, but he's Jewish, and so he is being pursued by the Gestapo, essentially. So the question is should Varian divert resources from his own operation toward the saving of this person whose future is really as yet unknown, who's all about potential, and should he take on a mission that came to him through a very personal vein? In other words, should he allow himself to be swayed by his emotional connection to somebody who who has a special kind of access to him, and so in the end, I guess what it came down to for Varian in the real situation he was dealing with, and that I think is kind of reflected in this fictional personal story, is that the rules changed continually. He would come to, sometimes people came to his list through recommendations, personal recommendations like the Benjamin recommendation. Sometimes they came through kind of, societal endorsements like Chagall. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they just showed up and demonstrated talent. And the fact was that all of those people were equally deserving of help, simply by virtue of being human beings. And I guess what's interesting in art are the places where people find themselves in intolerable situations. So when I teach my graduate students at NYU about the craft of writing, and one thing that I always tell them is what you are trying to do in a way as a writer is to create a perfect hell for your characters. You try to figure out what it is that they most fear, or what it is that they most want, or what it is that they keep secret, and then you place them in situations that require them to confront those fears, or find their wants unfulfilled, or have their secrets in danger of being revealed. And for Varian, being in the south of France in 1940, though many aspects of the situation were like heaven to him, because he got to meet all of these artists who had been inspiring to him, in fact, it was his perfect hell, because he wanted to help everybody and he couldn't. And so that, I think, is what drives all narrative in a way.
Yeah, and I think it was particularly difficult for him because he was feeling duped by his lover at that time, right? And then he saves Tobias at the expense of someone else.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he constantly had to face decisions like that.
Right.
Where resources being limited had to either go one way or another, and when they went in one direction, then someone else was shortchanged.
Yeah, yeah. So you open up the book with Varian visiting Marc and Bella Chagall, and who he eventually saves, right? And also featured in the book are, Hannah Arendt and Max Ernst, who are all among those that are rescued by the Emergency Rescue Committee, and he escaped France safely. So, but he saved thousands. So how did you choose, essentially, kind of the, putting yourself in Varian's position, how did you choose which of these artists you're going to feature in your book? Was that, what was that process for you?
Well, the process was that at first I wrote about 1,000-page draft that my editor read and was just like, oh no, let's lose 40% of this. And so a lot of the other artists who I would have loved to write about ended up on the cutting room floor. It was impossible to choose from among those unbelievably fascinating personalities. But one of the things that was really great was just to do the research and to hear who Varian was excited to be around, or who felt particularly inspired by his work, and to just to sort of think about those, the people who were surrounding him who he felt particularly passionate about. But then also it was a bit situational, because one of the cool things that happened while Varian was in France was that that one of his associates, Mary Jane Gold, proposed that the organization have a kind of a safe house where some of the refugee artists could be out of the public eye rather than being in the center of town and always under police scrutiny. So they rented this villa called the Villa Herbel, which is about 25 minutes outside the center of Marseille. And it was this really beautiful, kind of pastoral setting. And there were about, 15 bedrooms in the villa. And so it became a kind of artist colony there in this like beautiful Provençal countryside. And so I was really interested in who was staying at the villa and what it would have been like for all of these interesting creative minds to be under one roof. And so, so some of my choices were dictated by those what would I call it? Those domestic facts.
Mm. Yeah, and there's a very amazing party scene that happens there, right? So, you kind of referred to it when you were reading from the first chapter, that you do have a lot of food references in this book.
Yes, I'm guilty
and
as
the
self-charged.
parties at the Bel Air, or Airbel, and so, what were you thinking when there's this food shortage over in France during the war?
Yeah. So, but people have to get by in some way. And mostly what they got by on was drink. When there was no food around, they would just have a party and they would bring, a lot of art. And it was really interesting actually that in the midst of such dark times, these surrealist artists sort of survived on festivities and on sharing each other's work, sharing work with one another, which I think is always really important. And so it was cool to see how the surrealists who were sitting at the same dinner table might have challenged each other to take some chances. And there were things like they came up with this card game, the Marseille deck. They made their own deck of cards that had suits that were sort of parallel to the card suits, but they were things like the mage and the genius, and then there were like the cards were all made by hand and they were hand drawn, and then they played Exquisite Corpse, that surrealist game where you fold a piece of paper and you write a little bit of a sentence or you draw a little bit of a picture and then pass it on to the next person, and they can't look at the previous one, but they have to come up with their next one. Anyway, I just thought all of that was amazingly rich and fun to think about.
It was fun to read too.
But yeah, they did have some amazing parties that Varian described in his memoir. Not exactly the one you're referring to. In my novel, there's a naked dinner party that's set up as kind of a joke on somebody who's been a jerk. But that particular moment in the book was inspired by this incredible story that I read about in Mary Jane Gould's memoir, where she went to this Italian finishing school, and the proprietress of the finishing school instructed the young women as to how to behave in all circumstances. And so she tells her girls about a situation where she's invited to dinner at a duchess's house, and she arrives and all the guests are unclothed. And all the girls lean forward and say, well, what did you do, miss? How did you respond? And what do you do in a situation like that? And she said, well, girls, I just carried my chin high and I said, well, I'm going to just carry it off. And that was it. That was the instruction. And so I thought, oh, well, what would happen if you just had somebody arriving at a dinner party where everyone was unexpectedly nude? So
you just had to put it in the book.
Why not?
So you talked a little bit about this, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on some of the barriers that Varian and the Emergency Rescue Committee were facing during those 13 months that they were trying to get mostly Jewish artists and writers out of France. So you mentioned a little bit about the American government, but he had to collaborate with a lot of people. Could you talk a little bit more about those relationships and how that process worked?
Yeah.
How he was so successful?
Okay, so here were some of the problems. Visas, as I mentioned before. Routes of transit over the Pyrenees or on ships to places where people could get to safely. Money, where was that going to come from? the Nazis. Each one of these things was a profound barrier. So who did he collaborate with for help in these different areas? There was in the United States consulate, there was a young man named Harry Bingham, who was kind of like a junior consular officer, who was working in direct opposition to Hugh Fullerton, the consul general at the time, who basically put his foot down and said, these degenerates aren't getting into our country. Harry Bingham, working on his own steam and at the peril of his own career, just started writing visas for a lot of these clients of Varians because he knew that it was the right thing to do. And then things like the French exit visas. There was this young man named Daniel Benedict who had worked in the prefecture of police in Paris and who knew the ins and outs of the French visa process. And so he kind of knew what channels to suggest that Varian follow in Marseille to help get those French exit visas. Then there were paths over the Pyrenees that people could travel secretly. And so Varian had associates who were helping to lead his clients over the mountains, even when it was, incredibly perilous to do so. And then there were ship captains who were willing to take passengers who were not registered. The ports kept opening and closing, and sometimes there were actually times when the ports would just open and ships carrying hundreds of people were leaving. But in order for those clients of Varians to be able to actually get passage on those ships, they had to be able to afford steamer tickets. And you can imagine, with everybody wanting to get the heck out of France at that time, how expensive those tickets would have been. And so through people like Mary Jane Gould, who was friends with Peggy Guggenheim, he arranged for people to be kind of secretly donating funds to the Emergency Rescue Committee. He was also doing some clandestine work with British soldiers who were trapped in France, trying to get them out of France. Now that was treasonable, to be helping British soldiers in a time of war, when the US wasn't a part of the war. And so it was essentially like involving the US in the war at a time when they were not. And so there were all of these different kind of avenues for possibility where only barriers might be seen to exist from the outside. But the real magic was the coordination of all those factors at once. And then one of the most complicated things, actually, was to get the artists to be willing to leave.
Yeah.
Because some of the artists were so scared to even make a move that even when the visas and the money and the venues for escape existed, the artists themselves would say, no, we're not going to do it. And there were people who lost their lives because they hesitated.
Yeah, and like the Chigalls, which you started the book off with, they changed their mind at the
Yes,
end of the story, but they certainly
did.
started off thinking they weren't in danger. And as that 13 months went on, certainly times changed.
Right.
So I think I only have time for probably one more question before we open it up to the audience. So I wanted to ask you about the Netflix miniseries that's going to be out. What's the timeline on that, and how's that going to?
Well, it's so surreal that this is actually happening, but my friend Anna Winger is the executive producer and showrunner. She's the one who made Unorthodox, which hopefully some of you saw. She and I have known each other for like so many years, for like almost 15 years. And I didn't know for much of that time that she actually had relatives who were helped by Varian Fry's organization. And then she didn't know that I was working on this novel. And so finally one day we were like, oh my God, we have this incredible thing in common. And she said, I've always wanted to make a show about this. Let's work together on it. And so when she read the book, I think she began to really see how some of the narrative lines that I had introduced around Varian's sexuality and his personal history animated the book's narrative in a way that was new to her understanding. And so she assembled a team of writers, and during the pandemic, they were sitting in a writer's room together outside in Berlin, and then the scripts were refined over a number of months, and then we started shooting I guess it was in early February of this year, and so I was there in May for part of the shooting, and it was just absolutely incredible to see those scenes come to life. I mean, I can't tell you as much as I would like to yet about what is actually going to transpire in the series, but there were, I think one of the things that was most exciting about working with her was that she really understood the moral conundrum, and she really found ways to bring it to the screen. That even though the narrative differs from the one I told in certain ways, it really is just so full of fire and so full of faith to what was really animating that organization and its incredible endeavor. So I hope you'll all watch it. It's going to be out in April. Yeah, it's magical to see that happening.
Thank you, Julie. So we could talk for hours about this book and this topic, but I'd like to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the mic to come over. There's one here in the front, and if you could just stand up and ask your question.
Thank you so much. My question is about whether Varian Fry was influenced by the persecution of the Nazi persecution of homosexuals, and this was, as a closeted gay man, this was an opportunity to also get back at that.
That's such a great question. Was Varian influenced by the Nazi persecution of homosexuals? Well, I would need to be a little more knowledgeable than I am about the actual timeline of our knowledge of what the Nazis were doing to homosexuals. I feel like the book, The Pink Triangle, is one that we could read to kind of uncover that question a little bit further. It was one that I read actually in the research for my previous book, which also had gay characters who were kind of very central to the narrative. My sense is that Varian probably knew that in some way gay men and women and transgender people were part of the Nazis' idea of the final solution. Surely at the time he was in France, he would not have had very much information about what was actually happening in the concentration camps, but he would have known that that the Nazis were concentrating like people who fell in any way under that umbrella. And I think that it would have been animating to him for sure. To what degree that would have played an important role alongside his desire to save Jewish people and artists and anyone else who might have been persecuted, I'm not sure. But I can only imagine that it would have been influential in some way to his wanting to do this work. Thanks.
Hi. Oh, sorry, that's really loud. I just wanted to ask you, what inspired you to start writing, and what keeps you writing every day?
What a great question. What inspired me to start writing, and what keeps me writing every day? I would say that it really was reading that inspired me to write. Yeah, I mean, my parents, bringing books, a lot of books into the house when I was a kid, sitting with me when I was a kid and telling me, it's not just about reading, you can write books too. My dad used to make teeny tiny little books with me out of index cards that we would staple at the corner, and I would tell him the story and he would draw the funny pictures. Teachers I had who made creative writing a centerpiece of our study of the English language and literature. Other writers who were my age, whose work I read, who I was super inspired by, like my colleague Melinda McCollum, who's here in the audience, one of my colleagues at Iowa. Like friends whose work just was so different from mine, but who showed me kind of what was possible. Those are things that are continually inspiring. What inspires me to continue? Now that I'm in the habit of it, I can't really stop. It's also my livelihood. But there are always, the world is just thick with stories all around us. And if you get into the habit of paying attention to them, certain ones really resolve into a kind of urgency in your mind and demand exploration on the page. It's really not very easy. It doesn't really get easier, but there are rewards especially in the way certain stories can connect to readers and make them feel heard. So it's worth it. I think there was a question down here.
Thank you. I was wondering, in your research, were you able to contact any family members or friends of Varian?
Yes, so was I able to contact Varian's family and friends? Yeah, one of the people who I'm most grateful for his openness with me was Varian Fry's son, James Fry, who, when I was really trying to understand Varian's sexuality and how that might have affected his work and his later life, was really open with me about what he felt that his father might have experienced and how he felt that his father's homosexuality had sort of shaped the course of his life in a way. I talked to Jim both before and after some readers of the book raised objections and said, oh, it's just hearsay, Varian probably wasn't gay, and I was really grateful to Jim Fry for saying, like, it's really time that the story of my dad's sexuality was actually told. But not only that, why should it really matter when we're talking about his heroism? I do think it matters in the sense that, as our earlier questioner asked, it might have been influential in inspiring him to do what he did. But in effect, what is most important for us to remember about his story is that he undertook a kind of radical work of empathy, in understanding the peril that these people were in and in doing the work that was necessary to get them out. And that's something that we all should aspire to.
And a related question, I was curious if you have any information or can tell us anything about Varian Fry's life after the war.
Yeah, what a great question, too. His life after the war was complicated and in many ways an exercise in frustration. He had a tough time getting people back in the States, even after he had spent 13 months in France, even after he had spent time with people who had been in concentration camps and seen the concentration camps himself, to really get people to understand how bad things were in Europe at the time. He wrote a great deal about it. He wrote his memoir. He actually published his memoir in 1945, which was a time when not a lot of people wanted to hear about the US acting in ways that had been anything but perfectly heroic during the war. So that was part of what he faced, was just kind of this desire to see the United States at that time as kind of like monolithically good. But then I think part of what was difficult for him too was that while he was in France, he had this really immediate sense of purpose. He knew what he was doing every day. When he woke up in the morning, he knew why he was doing it. And when he came back, I think he really kind of cast about for work that would be as full of purpose as that was. He also really wrestled with his sexuality. His marriage ended, and he was alone for a time, and then he remarried. And during that time, he participated in Kinsey's experiments, and I think he was really heartened to understand, as Kinsey was framing it, that there was a continuum of sexuality, of sexual orientation. He writes about that in some of the papers that are housed at Columbia. But it was a really difficult series of decades that followed his return from France, and then he ended up dying at a fairly early age while he was in the process of rewriting his memoirs, in fact.
I think it's time to wrap up the session on the platform. I'd like to thank Julie Orringer and Elizabeth Meyer-Bernstein for really fascinating insight into an episode during the Second World War that is surprisingly little known, but you learn more about it obviously in the book, and of course from watching what I'm sure is going to be a spectacular mini-series in the spring. And just one other thing I'd like to say, I'd like to see how the festival events connect with one another. And Julie was telling us earlier on that when she was in France seeing some of the film coming to being filmed, that she was very aware of the writing saying in the Ukrainian refugees assembling in France and looking for a safe haven, and obviously various countries in Europe have opened their doors to them. So, you know, this is a story that took place in the Second World War, but it does still have current resonance. And of course, our first event at the festival earlier today focused on Ukraine and what was happening there at the moment. So anyway, let me thank Julie Orringer and Elizabeth Meyer-Bernstein.
Thank you. Thank you so much.